So I think we are ready to get started. It's 11:30. And welcome everyone to this MF CASR lunch, the second of the spring term. And it's really good to see you all again. And today I have Verena Meyer with me. Verena is a postdoc here at MF, started last August, if I remember correctly.
Yes, that's right.
And she's going to talk about grave matters, dilemmas of modernism in Islamic Java. And some practical information before we start. If you want to pose a question or make a comment to Verena, there's a chat function on Zoom if you are following us digitally. And if you're with us in the room, you have to move over to the microphone, which stands over here, to pose your question. And then there's also a handout. It's over there next to the coffee if you want one, if you're in the room. And if you're with us digitally, Esther will put it in the chat like now, I think, more or less. Yes. Okay, so now we're heading for like 13 minutes of presentation from Verena, and then we have like 13 minutes for questions and answers after that. Please.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for being here. Thanks especially to you, Olive, and to you, Esther, for facilitating all of this and like taking care of the various logistics. I realized a little too late that it is apparently Valentine's Day, and so perhaps it's not quite so appropriate that we talk about death. But, you know, here we are. So I'm talking today about a piece of my larger project, my book, which is titled Futures Past, The Politics of Memory in Islamic Java, in which I show, very broadly speaking, how memory practices of various sorts are made use of to articulate specific Muslim identities in Java, Indonesia. And in particular, I examine the divide between self-identified traditionalists and modernists, which are categories that have kind of pervaded identity politics in the Muslim world and perhaps also beyond for the last 100 years or so. In Islamic studies, over the last couple of decades, there has been a debate brewing where tradition and modernity are used as, well, basically as analytic categories that indicate what the German Islamic studies scholar Thomas Bauer has called tolerance of ambiguity. And according to this narrative, pre-modern and especially non-Western societies were quite open to and indeed were able to embrace and celebrate ambiguity and paradox as meaningful and productive ways to talk about God and to talk about the world and about the place of humans in relation to God and the world. And this is then always contrasted with the Christian West, which has supposedly always been inimical to ambiguity. And this lack of tolerance of ambiguity peaked in modernity and then was globalized through colonialism and its normative civilizing project, and of course impacted other religions and cultures like Islam, where a movement emerged that we now usually call Islamic modernism, and that embraced the Western norm of rational coherence and did away with this beautiful century-long embrace of ambiguity. So in the contemporary era, we only find ambiguity in self-identified traditionalist Muslim communities who very self-consciously reject the epistemic norms of Western modernity. So far the narrative. Now, my project attempts to problematize this assumption a little bit by showing that when we look at what's actually happening on the ground among people who identify as traditionalist or modernist, the capacity to handle ambiguity doesn't really map so neatly onto these categories, and that very often modernists are quite happy to make productive use of ambiguity, and traditionalists are quite strict about, enforcing rational coherence. And I argue that these findings really challenge these assumptions as they have been framed by modern identity politics. So my talk today is about one such example. Does everybody have a handout? I think there are a couple left. So if you don't have one, maybe take one, because I think it's quite important to see the pictures. Indonesia's largest modernist Islamic mass organization is called Muhammadiyah, and it was founded in 1912 by Ahmad Dahlan, who you also see in this picture here. But I'd like you to take a closer look at the picture of his grave that you see. As you see, it is a small plot that is enclosed by flat white stone slabs, quite low, and there is only a simple headstone that only lists his name. There's also a green sign behind the grave that marks it as the final resting place of a Pahlawan Nasional, or a national hero, which is a status that was bestowed onto Ahmad Dahlan by the Indonesian government in 1961, and they were the ones who put up the sign. If you look at the photo of the cemetery as a whole, you see that the other graves look exactly like his. You probably haven't hung out on Javanese graveyards as much as I have, but if you had, you would know that this cemetery is really, really weird. It's completely unusual. Usually, you know, headstones look very different from each other. Graves look different from each other. Headstones are in different stages of disrepair. There are chickens running around and they're pooping everywhere. And they're like dog-eared prayer books everywhere. And there's nothing of that here. It's a really unusual graveyard. And my modernist friends were always quite happy with this graveyard and proud of the fact that it was so clean. They call it clean because it is simple, because it discourages any sort of funny business that might be going on, like, you know, prayer, which is something that traditionalists like to do. And that is quite inimical to their modernist sensibilities. Because indeed, since their foundation in 1912, Muhammadiyah has pursued an agenda of purging from Islam what they understand as idolatry or fetishization, which is to say, acting as though material objects like graves had any special power or agency. Graves are places like any other, and the dead are just gone. They're done. They're no longer part of the phenomenal world. There's no way to access them in any way. But when it comes to important people like Ahmad Dahlan, it is especially important to make sure that people don't accidentally get confused and think, oh, you know, he's special, so his grave must be special, and then relapse into some sort of silly superstition. His place is no more special than any other place. So in the course of my field research, I talked to a lot of people about graves in general and about Dahlan's grave in particular, and people would usually tell me that his grave has always been this simple, but the Karangkajan cemetery, of which it is a part, has undergone relatively recent changes. Because in 2003, the leadership of the mosque that is right next to the cemetery decided that it was time to turn the site into what they called a properly Islamic graveyard. One of my frequent conversation partners was an elderly resident of the neighborhood and also a longstanding member of the mosque who had been involved in the initiative at the time. And he told me how they decided at the mosque that the cemetery should be renovated according to the Quran and the Sunnah, and that it was wrong to have large structures or gravestones on top of graves. So what they did was they put an announcement in the local newspaper and said, the Karangkajan cemetery is going to be renovated according to Islamic law. If you have a grave here, please come by the end of the month and renovate it. And if you don't do it, we'll just do it for you. And most people came and took care of the renovation themselves. And I guess the remainder was taken care of by the people of the mosque. And so now all graves look the same, including the grave of Ahmad Dahlan. So really underlining his grave isn't special, they're all the same. And yet things aren't quite as simple as they seem, because within Muhammadiyah, over the last 20 or so years, Ahmad Dahlan's gravesite has actually become a site of religious interest, and even to some extent, very, very, very carefully managed devotional practices that are normally associated with traditionalist Islam. Now, one needs to know a little bit of the historical background of Indonesia to understand why that is. In 1998, the oppressive regime that had ruled Indonesia since the 1960s, Suharto's New Order, was overthrown and a period of democratization began. And along with this democratization went a liberalization of the religious landscape that resulted in a bunch of organizations that had formerly been marginalized and oppressed to be able to pop up in the public sphere and to recruit members. And these included transnational Islamist organizations. Now, we're talking about organizations, some of which have a history of blowing up both Balinese nightclubs and graves where traditionalists like to pray. Muhammadiyah is modernist, but they're also very self-consciously moderate. And all of a sudden they were in a situation where the other people in Indonesia who very emphatically did not like graves were the people who they very much did not want to be like. So in that context, Muhammadiyah's leadership embarked on this initiative to cultivate memory practices to strengthen the organization's profile as a moderate organization with a historical claim to Indonesian Islam, kind of like, we've been here since 1912, you all are newcomers, you don't really belong here. And this program of strengthening the historical profile has included, among other things, visits to graves of important founding figures like Ahmad Dahlan that are often organized through Muhammadiyah groups or schools. And people who participated in these tours often told me that they found it really quite inspiring and even spiritually edifying to go there. But it has also complicated for them because in doing so, they have to negotiate these two conflicting anxieties, the anxiety of being like the fundamentalists who destroy graves and being like traditionalists who supposedly idolize graves. So it's kind of a tightrope walk where they have to distance themselves on both sides. Scholars of the materiality of religion have often drawn on Bruno Latour's notion of purification as being an intrinsic concern of modernist ideologies. According to Latour, purification is the separation of humans and things and the relegation of metaphysics from the public sphere to the individual's heart. So I think it is just such a purification that has been performed in the renovation of the Karankajin cemetery of curating the sanitized conformity that shows that graves are just objects without any metaphysical agency. But Latour emphasized that purification is bound to fail because any kind of communication is always material in some sense. So here too, this kind of carefully curated and enforced simplicity is, at the end of the day, a material expression of a detachment from materiality, or kind of an emphatic performance of a rejection. There are also stories that go along with this performance of a rejection. When Muhammadiyah activists today talk about Ahmad Dahlan's grave and the beginnings of its commemoration, they often emphasize that after his death in 1923, he was just buried and then nobody cared where his grave was and it was basically forgotten. But then in 1955, Indonesia hosted the Bandung Conference, or the Asia-Africa Conference, and a bunch of people from North Africa came to Indonesia, and they apparently really admired Muhammadiyah, and they wanted to know where the founder was buried. They were like, we want to go visit him. And then it turned out that nobody knew. So, so the government went to Muhammadiyah and asked, so where's your founder buried? And they were like, yeah, so this old guy here, he was at the funeral 30 years ago, let's ask him. And he came and he was like, yeah, I think it was somewhere here. So then they put the stone up and, so and then finally the grave was made somewhat presentable and the stone was put up and the African guests were invited to come. But for some, even the simple grave and especially the sign, the green sign behind it by the Indonesian government is kind of too much. I've often been told the story of a mysterious thief who comes at night and takes the sign down. And nobody really knows who did it or when it happened or how often or why, but it's like everybody talks about it all the time. And like when people tell me about it, it's often with a great deal of sympathy. It's kind of like, yeah, because we don't like signs. Signs are not good because they look as though it's special. But then the sign is put up again, a new sign is put up. And of course, nobody seriously opposes that either. So, it's again this tightrope walk. So we see in these stories that Muhammadiyah's two fundamental impulses, purification and commemoration, are kind of in tension and perhaps even in fundamental opposition, but they also really depend on each other as Muhammadiyah works out what exactly it means for them to memorialize their past without any sort of idolatry and without fetishizing objects. So remembering Ahmad Dahlan at his grave is only safe in an environment where this purification has already been accomplished and where it continues to be staged all the time through this carefully crafted image of not caring about it, and where it is told that the identification of the grave wasn't even their idea to begin with, because then it cannot be mistaken for the kind of thing that is done by traditionalists, right? Likewise, the mosque's enforcement of this sort of purified, the sanitized purification of the graveyard and like all graves looking alike, or even the thieves taking the sign would be completely meaningless if people didn't talk about it and talked about what sort of impact it makes on them. And I think what is important is that what looks like a contradictory engagement with the materiality of Ahmad Dahlan's grave, or even, as some would argue, an inherent limitation of modernist discourse, I think might in fact be a very successful deployment of ambiguity as the organization's different concerns are positioned vis-a-vis the other, because by themselves, either of them would run danger of tipping this delicate balance that Muhammadiyah is kind of this tightrope walk, to be a moderate organization that is unlike traditionalism and unlike Islamism, but together through this tension that they produce, they kind of hold it in place. Thank you.
Thank you.